Black CEO publicly ridiculed by white billionaire family. Minutes later, he destroys a $50 billion deal. Hello everyone, before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the story. Clean floors. That's your job. The words cut through the ballroom like glass dragged across marble. Laughter followed, sharp, effortless, rehearsed. It echoed beneath crystal chandeliers the size of small cars, bounced off gold-trimmed walls, and settled comfortably into the folds of tailored tuxedos and silk gowns. This was a place built for excess and exclusion. A charity gala hosted by one of the oldest billionaire families in the city. Old money. Old power. Old assumptions. At the center of it all stood a black man in a perfectly fitted black tuxedo. He was tall. Composed. Still. While others clustered in loose circles, champagne flutes in hand, he stood alone, one hand at his side, the other holding a phone to his ear. His posture was straight, unyielding. Not stiff. Controlled. As if the room existed around him, not over him. Behind him, a group of white men in tuxedos pointed openly. One of them laughed too hard. A woman in a silver gown covered her mouth, pretending to whisper, while her eyes stayed fixed on him. Another guest raised his phone, angling for the best shot. Public humiliation made for good content. Seriously, the man added, louder now. Staff entrance is around the back. More laughter. The black man didn't turn. He didn't flinch. He didn't correct them. He listened. The voice on the other end of the call was calm, professional. Numbers. Timelines. Confirmations. The kind of conversation that moved markets quietly while rooms like this obsessed over appearances. The man's eyes drifted upward, briefly, to the chandelier above him, hundreds of lights refracting through crystal, dazzling but cold. Then his gaze lowered again, steady and unreadable. Around him, the crowd grew bolder. One of the women stepped closer, emboldened by the attention. "You're blocking the aisle," she said with a smile that never reached her eyes. "People are trying to enjoy the evening." A finger jabbed toward the polished floor at his feet. "Go on," someone muttered. "Do what you're here for." Phones were everywhere now. What had started as a joke had turned into spectacle. A room full of powerful people, unified not by generosity or purpose but by the comfort of assuming they were better. The man ended the call. He lowered the phone slowly, deliberately, as if timing the movement to the rhythm of the room. The laughter softened, uncertain now. Some expected an outburst. Others hoped for an apology. A few leaned forward, eager. Nothing came. He looked around the ballroom for the first time, not with irritation, not with anger, but with the detached calm of someone assessing assets. Faces. Expressions. Reactions. He took them in the way an appraiser studies fine art. Not for beauty. For value. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to Marcus. Marcus adjusted his cufflinks. A small movement. Almost invisible. But it shifted something in the air. The laughter didn't stop, but it thinned. One of the men pointing at him hesitated, his hand slowly dropping. "Hey," another voice called out, less confident now. "Relax. It's just a joke." Marcus met his eyes. Not with hostility. With clarity. The kind that made people uncomfortable because it wasn't asking for approval. Across the room, at the head table, members of the billionaire family continued sipping champagne, oblivious. They were too busy discussing a deal numbers so large they had stopped sounding real. $50 billion. A merger that would save them. Elevate them. Secure their legacy. They had no idea the man standing alone beneath their chandelier was the one holding the pen. Marcus slipped his phone back into his jacket. The room buzzed again, mistaking his silence for submission. They were wrong. And within minutes, the cost of that mistake would be measured in billions. The laughter didn't disappear after Marcus went silent. It lingered. Like smoke trapped beneath crystal chandeliers. A few guests tried to reclaim the moment, forcing smiles, pretending the tension hadn't shifted. Someone clinked a glass too loudly. Another made a joke that landed flat. The orchestra resumed, but the music felt thinner now, brittle, as if it knew it was playing over something unstable. Marcus remained where he was. Not defiant. Not submissive. Present. Two men from the white billionaire family stood several feet away, whispering openly. They didn't bother lowering their voices. He didn't even apologize, one scoffed. Staff these days, the other replied. No respect. A woman in an ivory gown leaned toward her companion. Security should handle it, she said. He's making people uncomfortable. Uncomfortable. Not because he'd done anything but because he hadn't. Across the ballroom, a senior member of the hosting family finally noticed the disturbance. He followed the line of pointing fingers, the subtle shift in attention, and his eyes landed on Marcus. His expression tightened not with concern, but irritation. He gestured to a security supervisor near the wall. The supervisor nodded and began moving through the crowd. Marcus watched it happen with peripheral calm. He didn't turn. He didn't prepare an argument. He simply adjusted his stance, shoulders relaxed, weight evenly balanced like a man who had already decided the outcome. The security supervisor stopped a few steps short of him. Sir, he began, tone rehearsed, professional but firm. Is there a problem here? Marcus met his gaze. No, he said evenly. Is there? The supervisor hesitated. That wasn't the response he'd expected. Not defensive. Not apologetic. Around them, phones lifted again. The crowd leaned in, sensing escalation. Well, the man said, glancing back toward the head table, this area is reserved. For guests, Marcus replied. The word landed quietly but it drew a line. The supervisor shifted, suddenly aware of the attention on him. He cleared his throat. I'm going to need you to step aside while we sort this out. Marcus didn't move. Instead, he reached into his jacket and checked his phone not urgently, not nervously. A single new message sat unread. Read. No reply. He looked back up. I'll be finished shortly, he said. Not a request. A statement. At the head table, the billionaire patriarch frowned. What's taking so long, he muttered. This is embarrassing. Beside him, a family member laughed. Relax. He'll be gone in a minute. They returned to their conversation, discussing the deal, how close it was, how inevitable. $50 billion. A partnership they believed was already theirs. Papers drafted. Announcements prepared. The final signature was a formality. They spoke freely. Too freely. Marcus could hear fragments as the sound drifted across the room. Numbers. Timelines. Assumptions. Confidence built on certainty that had never been tested. The security supervisor took a step closer. Sir. Marcus raised a hand. Not aggressively. Just enough to pause the moment. I said I'd be finished shortly. The supervisor stopped. For reasons he couldn't explain, he did. A subtle crack formed in the room's confidence. A few guests exchanged looks. One of the men who had laughed earlier now studied Marcus more carefully. The tuxedo. The watch. The way he stood. Doubt crept in. Marcus glanced once more around the ballroom, committing faces to memory. Not out of spite but accuracy. These were people who believed access equaled worth. That power announced itself loudly. They were about to learn how wrong they were. He slipped his phone back into his pocket. The deal was still alive. For now. The room believed it understood Marcus. That was the mistake. From the vantage point of the billionaire family, he was already categorized, already filed away into something manageable. A disruption. An embarrassment. A staffer who had forgotten his place. Nothing more. At the head table, the patriarch leaned back in his chair, swirling champagne as if the evening were still fully under his control. His wife smiled politely at a donor, her eyes flicking past Marcus without interest. To them, people like him existed in the background, necessary, invisible, replaceable. He doesn't look like trouble, one of the family members murmured. None of them ever do, another replied, amused. They laughed softly, the kind of laughter reserved for things not worth worrying about. In their world, power was loud. It announced itself with last names etched into buildings, with entourages and bodyguards, with invitations that opened doors before questions were asked. Power wore diamonds and demanded recognition. Marcus wore none of that. Which was why they missed him. What they didn't see was the precision in his stillness. The discipline in the way he conserved movement. The habit of listening more than speaking. Those traits had never been taught in their circles. They were learned elsewhere, earned, not inherited. A few tables away, two executives whispered. Is he someone's guest? Doubt it. He'd be sitting with them if he mattered. Mattered? The word floated easily in rooms like this. It had nothing to do with contribution, or consequence. It meant access. It meant lineage. It meant looking the part. Marcus had built entire markets without ever needing to look like them. He'd learned early that visibility was a liability. That real leverage moved best when unseen. Over the years, he'd trained himself to stay off stages, out of photos, behind layers of legal structures and intermediaries. His name appeared on documents, not magazine covers. His decisions shaped industries, quietly. That privacy wasn't caution. It was strategy. At the head table, the family returned to discussing the deal with growing confidence. They spoke as if it were already done. As if the outcome had been decided long before tonight. Once this closes, we're untouchable, someone said. 50 billion buys a lot of forgiveness, another replied. Marcus heard it all. Not because he was trying to, but because arrogance is loud when it feels safe. The security supervisor remained nearby, uncertain now, no longer sure who he was meant to remove or why. The earlier certainty had drained from his posture. He glanced once toward the head table, then back at Marcus. Sir, he said more quietly, are you expected? Marcus met his eyes again. Yes. One word. Calm. Final. The supervisor nodded slowly, as if filing that answer away for later. Across the room, a woman who had been filming lowered her phone. She frowned, studying Marcus with fresh curiosity. Something about the way the moment refused to resolve unsettled her. Scenes like this were supposed to end cleanly with apologies, or escorts, or submission. This one didn't. Marcus checked his phone again. Another message had arrived. This time, he read it twice. The deal was still being discussed at the head table. Still assumed. Still alive. But the foundation beneath it had begun to shift. And the people laughing under the chandeliers had no idea how fragile their certainty really was. Marcus had learned long ago that power revealed itself best in reverse. Not when it entered a room but when it withdrew. He hadn't grown up around chandeliers or charity galas. There were no inherited board seats or last names that opened doors before he knocked. His education came from watching systems fail people quietly, repeatedly, without apology. From understanding that visibility was often the tax paid by those who couldn't afford real leverage. So he chose a different path. Over 2 decades, Marcus built an empire without ever attaching his face to it. Not out of fear but precision. He founded companies through holding structures, placed partners forward-facing while he remained absent, negotiated through attorneys who never shared photographs. His name carried weight in contracts, not conversations. The result was intentional invisibility. Most people in that ballroom had never seen him before. They'd read reports, signed NDAs, spoken about him in closed rooms as the principal or the controlling interest. In their minds, he was abstract. Older. White. Predictable. Certainly not the man standing quietly near the center of their gala. That assumption was what made nights like this possible. Marcus's phone vibrated once more. This time, the message wasn't a question. It was confirmation. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Across the room, the billionaire family leaned closer together, voices dropping as the conversation turned technical. Legal structures. Timelines. Dependencies they'd worked hard to hide. They were nervous but not afraid. Not yet. They still believed the deal was inevitable. Marcus remembered sitting in rooms years earlier, very different rooms where men like these had spoken past him, over him, through him. Where his ideas were praised only after being repeated by someone else. Where his presence was tolerated, never respected. He remembered learning to listen instead. Listening had taught him everything he needed to know. The security supervisor shifted again, uncomfortable now in a way that had nothing to do with protocol. He wasn't sure why, but instinct told him this situation didn't belong in the usual categories. He stepped back, giving Marcus space. No one questioned it. The crowd had begun to recalibrate. The laughter was gone. In its place, glances. Reconsideration. That subtle social tremor that occurs when confidence no longer feels unanimous. Marcus felt it and ignored it. He wasn't there to be recognized. He was there to decide. Another glance at the head table confirmed what he already knew. They were still talking as if tomorrow was guaranteed. As if capital, once promised, could not be withdrawn. As if dignity was optional when money was involved. They were wrong on all counts. Marcus straightened his jacket and exhaled slowly, not from tension, but completion. Everything he needed was already in motion. No speeches. No announcements. No need to correct anyone's assumptions. The correction would come later. And it would be permanent. He placed his phone back in his pocket and waited. The deal still existed. But only because he was allowing it to. The moment didn't announce itself. It arrived disguised as arrogance. At the head table, one of the younger members of the billionaire family leaned back in his chair, loosening his tie as if the night were already won. His voice carried farther than he realized. Confidence has a way of projecting itself. I don't understand why this deal took so long, he said with a smirk. 50 billion should buy loyalty. A few people chuckled. Another added, quieter but sharper, some people should just be grateful to be in the room. The words floated across the ballroom. They landed. Marcus felt them settle not on his pride, but on his patience. He had tolerated the laughter. The pointing. The assumptions. Those were expected. Predictable. Almost dull. But this casual reduction of dignity into currency crossed a different line. Not because it offended him, but because it revealed exactly who they were. And that was information. Marcus turned slightly, just enough to face the head table. No one noticed at first. The room was still pretending everything was fine. Still hiding discomfort behind champagne and music. Then his phone vibrated. Once. He glanced at the screen. A single name. A single line of text. Ready when you are. Marcus didn't hesitate. He stepped a few feet away from the crowd, positioning himself near one of the marble columns. Not for privacy, there was none, but for clarity. The noise of the room softened, as if the space itself understood something final was about to happen. He raised the phone to his ear. "Yes," he said. The word was quiet. Controlled. A pause. "Now." That was all. No explanation. No elaboration. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his jacket. Across the room, laughter spiked again, one last attempt at normalcy. Someone clinked a glass. Someone else made a joke about staff uniforms. Marcus didn't look at them. He didn't need to. At the head table, a phone buzzed. Then another. A third. The patriarch frowned, glancing down at his screen. His smile faded, not dramatically, but enough to notice. He read the message once. Then again. "What is it?" his wife asked. He didn't answer. One of the younger executives leaned over. "Is something wrong?" The patriarch's fingers tightened around his phone. Across the ballroom, the security supervisor's radio crackled softly. He stiffened, listening. His eyes drifted toward Marcus, then snapped back to the head table. A ripple passed through the guests. Subtle. Uneasy. Marcus stood perfectly still. The trigger had been pulled, not with anger, not with spectacle, but with precision. Systems were already responding. Legal teams mobilizing. Accounts locking. Commitments unraveling. All without a single raised voice. The billionaire family still hadn't grasped what had happened. They were searching for explanations that fit their world: technical glitches, misunderstandings, delays. They weren't looking at Marcus. They should have been. Because their deal was no longer protected by assumption or arrogance. It was standing on nothing but his decision. And that decision had already been made. The collapse didn't come with an announcement. It arrived as noise. A low, spreading hum of phones vibrating across the ballroom. At first, no one reacted. Wealth insulated people from urgency. Messages could wait. Crises were for assistants and subordinates. Then one of the phones rang. A sharp, insistent sound that cut through the orchestra. The patriarch answered it reluctantly, irritation already in his tone. He listened for less than 10 seconds before his expression changed. The color drained from his face, not all at once, but in stages. Like a building losing power floor by floor. He ended the call without a word. His wife leaned in. "What is it?" He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed somewhere far past the room. "There's been a development." Another phone rang at the table. This one was answered on speaker by mistake. "We just lost the financing," a panicked voice said. "Every tranche. Every backstop. They pulled everything." A few heads turned. Someone laughed nervously. "Pulled what?" The voice on the phone didn't laugh back. "The entire commitment. All 50 billion. Effective immediately." Silence rushed in where music had been. The patriarch snapped the phone off speaker, but the damage was done. Words like withdrawn, terminated, frozen traveled faster than the orchestra could cover them. Guests leaned toward one another. Phones came out again, this time not to film humiliation, but to chase information. "What's going on? Is this real? That can't just disappear." But it had. Across the room, Marcus watched the chain reaction with clinical detachment. He didn't smile. He didn't move. He simply observed as cause became effect. At the head table, the family scrambled. Advisors were called. Texts sent. Assistants waved closer. Faces that had worn certainty minutes earlier now strained to manufacture explanations. There must be a mistake, someone said. Get legal on the line. Call the bank. All of them. They did. And one by one, the answers came back the same. The deal was dead. Not delayed. Not renegotiated. Dead. The security supervisor's radio crackled again, this time loud enough for Marcus to hear. Confirmed, a voice said. Corporate directive. We stand down. The supervisor swallowed hard. He glanced at Marcus not with suspicion now, but recognition. The pieces had finally aligned. Around them, the room shifted into chaos. Guests whispered urgently. Donors edged away from the head table as if distance might protect them. A few people who had laughed earlier now avoided eye contact altogether. No one laughed anymore. The patriarch stood abruptly, chair scraping against marble. This is unacceptable, he said, louder than necessary. Someone will explain this to me. Now. No one did. Because there was only one explanation, and it was standing alone beneath the chandelier. Marcus felt the weight of the room turn toward him. The realization moved slowly at first, then all at once. Whispers sharpened into understanding. That's him. That's the one. The black man they had mocked. The man they had mistaken for staff. The man who had said nothing while deciding everything. Marcus adjusted his jacket once more and turned away from the crowd. The damage was done. And for the first time that night, the people who had controlled the room understood what it felt like to lose it. The shift was unmistakable. It moved through the ballroom like a pressure change, quiet, physical, impossible to ignore. Conversation stalled mid-sentence. Laughter died unfinished. People who had been standing tall minutes earlier now leaned closer to one another, voices lowered, eyes darting. The crowd had turned. Not in Marcus's favor exactly, but away from the family that had lost control. Phones were no longer pointed at him. They were pointed at the head table. At the patriarch whose hands trembled as he tried and failed to regain authority. At the wife who stared down at her glass as if answers might surface in the champagne. Whispers spread, sharp and efficient. That was the deal. All of it? Gone. Every dollar. A donor quietly stepped back from the table, creating distance. Another followed. Then another. Proximity had become risk. The same people who had laughed earlier now avoided eye contact with Marcus entirely. Some out of shame. Others out of fear. A few watched him carefully, reassessing every detail they'd missed before: the cut of his tuxedo, the restraint in his movements, the way he occupied space without asking permission. Recognition settled in. Across the room, one of the men who had pointed at Marcus earlier muttered, "We didn't know." The words sounded hollow the moment they left his mouth. Knowing, it turned out, had never been the requirement. The patriarch finally found his voice again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, forcing volume into the room, "there appears to be a misunderstanding. We're handling it." No one responded. The orchestra had stopped playing. The silence was complete. Marcus felt eyes on him from every direction now, not mocking, not amused, but calculating. People were trying to understand where they stood in relation to him. Who they had aligned with. What they had said. Whether their laughter had been noticed. It had. But Marcus didn't linger on it. He took one last look around the room, not with triumph, but with detachment. This was the moment people imagined power felt like: attention, silence, fear. In reality, it was simply confirmation. The security supervisor stepped aside as Marcus began to walk. Not instructed. Not signaled. Instinct. The path opened naturally. Guests moved out of his way without being asked. Heads turned. Conversations fell quiet as he passed. At the doorway, Marcus paused. Not to address the room. Not to claim victory. Just long enough for the message to settle. Then he left. Behind him, the gala unraveled completely, alliances dissolving, confidence evaporating, a family forced to confront the cost of mistaking dignity for weakness. And for the first time that night, the silence wasn't imposed. It was earned. Marcus didn't stop because he needed the room. He stopped because the room needed him too. Just beyond the doorway, with one hand on the cold metal handle, he turned back, not fully, not dramatically. Just enough. The movement alone drew every remaining ounce of attention toward him. Even the people pretending to check their phones froze. No one spoke. He looked at the billionaire family one last time. Not with satisfaction. Not with anger. With something far more unsettling. Clarity. This, Marcus said calmly, his voice carrying without effort, didn't happen because of a deal. A few people swallowed. It happened because you forgot something basic. He let the silence stretch. Long enough to make the lesson unavoidable. You didn't lose $50 billion tonight, he continued. You lost it the moment you decided respect was optional. The patriarch opened his mouth, whether to apologize, to argue, to negotiate, no one knew. Marcus didn't wait to find out. You never knew who I was, Marcus said, almost gently. And that's fine. His gaze swept the room, passing over faces that had laughed, filmed, whispered. But you knew I was a human being, he finished. That should have been enough. No raised voice. No emphasis. Just truth. He turned away, the words settling behind him like a verdict. Outside the ballroom, the city waited, cool, indifferent, honest. The doors closed softly, sealing in the aftermath. Inside, people stood motionless, unsure of how to reassemble a night that had come apart so completely. No one followed him. They were too busy recalculating. Inside the gala, the family finally broke. Advisors whispered urgently. Donors quietly excused themselves. Calls went unanswered. The weight of what had happened pressed down, not as spectacle, but consequence. Marcus walked down the corridor alone, his steps measured, unhurried. The deal was gone. The lesson delivered. There was nothing left to say. Power, he knew, didn't need applause. It only needed to be exercised. And tonight, it had spoken clearly, cleanly, and without mercy. By morning, the city was already telling the story for him. Headlines didn't name Marcus at first. They didn't have to. They spoke in euphemisms: a surprise withdrawal, an unexpected collapse, a deal that vanished overnight. Analysts argued on television. Commentators speculated. No one could explain how a transaction that large could disappear without warning. Inside boardrooms and private offices, the truth was clearer. Phones rang before dawn. Credit lines tightened. Partners distanced themselves. Invitations were quietly rescinded. The billionaire family that had once defined the room now found doors opening more slowly, voices less eager, smiles more cautious. Power, it turned out, was loyal only while it was useful. At the center of the fallout was a single decision. Marcus spent the morning exactly as he planned to. No interviews. No statements. No victory laps. He reviewed reports, approved next steps, and moved on. The deal had been one path among many. Its absence changed nothing about where he was going. What lingered wasn't the money. It was the memory. In the weeks that followed, the story evolved. People who had been in the ballroom replayed the moment in their minds: the laughter, the phones, the silence that came after. Some felt embarrassment. Others felt fear. A few felt something closer to understanding. They had witnessed power without performance. The family never publicly apologized. They couldn't. Apologies implied leverage, and they no longer had any. Their name remained, but its weight diminished. In rooms like that, reputation was currency and theirs had devalued overnight. Marcus never returned to that ballroom. He didn't need to. The lesson had already traveled further than he ever could. Quietly, efficiently, through conversations and contracts and unspoken corrections. Through people who thought twice before pointing. Before laughing. Before assuming. Because dignity, once ignored, had proven expensive. And somewhere between the chandeliers and the silence, an entire room had learned what happens when you mistake restraint for weakness and humanity for insignificance. No speeches. No applause. Just consequence. Exactly as it should be.